Hey everybody, let's talk a little bit about this HealthCo case. We're getting toward the end of the course, so these cases are getting more and more complex. And what I like about these last few cases is how real they are. I can relate myself, having worked in healthcare in a big hospital system for, oh gosh, I guess about 3 years as an internal OD person and consulting psychologist. So here are a few remarks about points, because many of you, that's what's important is the points. And points are important. I'm hoping that the learning, especially if you're going to go into the field of OD, I'm hoping that the learning is actually more important than points, but that's a hard one to call. So I'm looking at my list here. Most people, quite a few people, I guess not every single person, answered the questions substantially enough to earn 20 points, the maximum um, for the question without the extra credit, so 20. If you see something less than 20, so I'm looking at 18s, 10s, a couple of 5s, what that generally means is that you probably described data or described how a diagnosis is conducted rather than saying how you would conduct a diagnosis. To say, how would you diagnose the organization? And to say, well, diagnosis is done with interviews and observations and data collection and so on, surveys and questionnaires, does not tell me how you would diagnose HealthCo, an organization of 6,700 employees, 9 hospitals stratified over the east coast of the United States. How would you do that? And that's a very, very important question. Even if you don't have an answer, it's important to understand the magnitude of that question. That was a pretty tough question. How would you get, and I'll get to that in a second. Some of you chose to really not reply to what your own diagnosis is. Instead, you're saying, well, this is what they need to do. This is the intervention they need. That's, again, that's not a diagnosis. You weren't asked, what are the specific interventions that you would provide. I mean, you had the opportunity to say, what is your assessment of the situation? But right now, the real question was, how would you diagnose a large, complex organization? And it isn't even that large. I mean, 6,700 employees is certainly a lot of people, but how about 25,000 around the world? So it really is a complex question. So where can you find the answers? Well, I'm going to talk about my approach in a second, but I want to point out, draw your attention to at least a few folks. If you really want to see what are some good answers, if you want to know what is a grade A reply to these 3 questions in the case study. And many people did really, really well, and you can see by how many points you got. But a few people really stood out for me in the way that they went down to basics and talked about what a diagnosis is, and whether it's at the individual, the group, or the organizational level, and what does it mean, and how do we do that. Um, and Jeremy, Stephen Herring, Michelle Morgan, and Frank all did a really nice job. And I'm pointing them out because if you really are getting into the OD field, or want to get into the OD field, understanding diagnostic activities and eventually interventions, which we get into at UIW in the ORGD 6352 course, OD interventions course, to get into it a bit more. But at least understanding, what do we mean when we say we're going to diagnose an organization? If you go to a physician and the physician, you go in and you say, I have a chronic cough. I actually had this occur about a year ago. I went in there and I said, I have a chronic cough. I just cough for long periods of time and I don't know why. It's not like I have a cold. I just have a cough. Okay, so that's a description of the situation. Unhappy employees at HealthCo, as described in the case study, is a description of what's going on. It's a sort of a symptom. And there's a difference between a symptom and a cause. And in the OD world, and in the world of medicine, of course, the interventionist, the physician, or the OD person is interested, well, what is the cause? Why do you have this cough going on? And so I ended up having to have golly, what was it? It was a needle biopsy, where they actually stuck a needle all the way into my lung and biopsied this thing to make sure it wasn't cancer. And it wasn't, but that was the intervention. And so the diagnosis was more than a description of you have a cough. The diagnosis was there's a nodule or something on your lung that we don't understand and we need to go and get it. That's the diagnosis. The activity, the intervention is going and getting it. So for those of you who are stuck in this kind of describing theoretically what something is a lot different than applying that knowledge on what you would do. So many of you receive questions from me that said, how would you diagnose this activity? How would, this organization, what activities would you use? Some of you, and this is, I'm getting into, my response to this, what would I do? And some of you had the same approach I would. Here's the deal, folks. 1.5 times turnover. They're 150% higher than average. They are losing people like crazy. That's, in my experience, I would automatically rule out a single easy cause like work-life balance. Stress is a little bit more useful if it's organization-wide. So that takes us to something called organization-wide. When you do a diagnosis, are you going to diagnose at the organizational level, the entire organization? Are you going to diagnose at a group level, maybe the HR department? Or are you going to diagnose at an individual level, that is speaking to individuals one at a time and see what's going on at the individual level? So that's the first thing that comes to mind, is I would want to diagnose, for me, at the organizational level with these kinds of symptoms, okay? There's a difference between a symptom and a cause. What you see in a case study are the symptoms. What the diagnosis is gives you the cause, like the nodule on the lung gives you the cough. The cause of the cough symptom is the nodule on the lung, the cause. So the same thing in an organization. We've got to figure out what is causing this organization to have the symptoms it's having. For me, especially given the breadth of this case study, or the breadth of the organization, the size of the organization, 6,700 people, 9 hospitals, clinics, all the other things described throughout the East Coast. That's big. That's big. So for me, I would certainly agree with those of you who hinted at an organization level diagnosis and a probably group level diagnosis. This problem with work-life balance and stress is symptomatic of something far bigger than just work-life balance. Indeed, healthcare institutions are stressful places to work. I've done it. I get it. Some of you, I think, work in healthcare, and you get it too. It's a tough, very tough industry to be in. Okay, so first thing on how would you go about diagnosing, I would set up an organization level diagnosis, and for me I would use a systems model. The Wiseboard 7-box model is great. The Jelinas and James model that I talked about last week, actually earlier this week in response to last week's case study, is great. But I would be far more curious. I would, I guess in an intervention in a doctoral, what am I want to say? Physical environment, medical, there we go, medical environment. If someone comes in with a whole bunch of symptoms, I'm not going to look and say, well, you have one tiny little thing going on, in your lung. I might be interested in a full body scan, right? We're going to do a full body scan and look at every major organ and system in your body. And therein can lie, obviously, some very problematic things like cancer and other things. So, that's full body scan is kind of an analogy, I think, for what I would do. In this case, I would use a systems model. I would try to get beyond the symptoms. Well, I would have to get beyond the symptoms that are described in the text and try to get to the causes. So let me see, what else do I want to say about this? Yeah, there are a number of, in this section of the book that the case is drawn from, there are a number of excellent figures and tables. I'm looking right now at workplace stressors. If you wanted to diagnose stress as part of an organization-wide diagnosis, which is probably a good idea in stress in healthcare, page 508. Page 508 is a great page to look at for the type of stressors to diagnose, and then it takes you all the way into typical interventions. Let's see, what else do I have in my notes? Oh, yeah, there's a word in systems theory called equifinality, EQUIFINALITY, equifinality. It's a fancy way of saying there's more than one way to skin the cat, and there's more than one way to diagnose and treat an organization or intervene in an organization. And so in many cases, there is no right answer to this case study, except to say, or to indicate that you understand, number one, what a diagnosis is. If you've lost points, it's because I'm not convinced that you understand what a diagnosis is and how to conduct one. In a large organization like HealthCo, could you use surveys? Yeah, I mean, there's pros and cons to surveys, and you can see that in the book. A couple of you mentioned that. Could you use surveys throughout the entire organization, all 9 hospitals and all the clinics and everything? Yeah, you could do that. Could you interview? I would say yeah, and I think only one person, 1 or 2 people mentioned culture and leadership. And for me, that's where everything starts. It starts at the top, just like in the Jelinas and James model in my presentation earlier this week. You start with leadership. So the CEO of HealthCo was saying, well, yeah, let's get a team together. That's great. That's a nice beginning. And to be a part of that would be excellent. And to gather ideas and suggestions from those at the top is an excellent way to start, to include them, to have a leadership team. Probably then to form some employee teams to go out into the organization where they are throughout all the 9 hospitals and all that, and gather more data in each of the areas of either the Wiseboard 7-box model or the Jelinas and James model that I use, and come back and say, hey, we've done a full body scan. You know, a bunch of us under the supervision and watchful eye of you, the OD consultant, went out and gathered data in all these different areas to conduct an organization-wide diagnosis. And that led to probably additional diagnoses at the group level. And you might even look, is there a leadership issue? Because you're going to diagnose leadership out there. Say, is there a leadership issue? Is the problem the CEO who seems to be running an organization that has 1.5 times turnover? Is that a problem? Well, I'll tell you what the board of directors has to say. Yes, the CEO might be the very problem, the heart of the problem. And here you got an organization that's losing 1.5 times the normal loss of employees. Something's happening. And guess who's responsible for running that organization? CEO and his or her staff. So is the CEO part of the problem? Absolutely. Is there a leadership problem? Absolutely. Is it probably embedded in the culture? My hunch is absolutely. So I would want to think about a culture change intervention organization-wide based on data collected through interviews and observations, well, maybe observations, but interviews and questionnaire survey data to help me understand each of the problems at each of those either Wiseboard 7-box model areas of diagnosis or the Jelinas and James model. I happen to like that. I think that's it. I'm looking at my notes. I think that's probably as much as I want to say. If you were on track with what a diagnosis, not only what a diagnosis is, but how you would diagnose and what areas of the company that you would diagnose. And if you mentioned organization versus group versus individual level diagnosis, I think you understand it. And that's excellent. If you don't, go back and revisit some of this stuff, especially if you want to get in the OD field. You don't want to get through this course and 6352 if you're OD oriented and not know what diagnosis is and how to conduct it and what it means. So take the time. Now is the time, folks, to gather make sure you understand this stuff. And if you're not going to go into the OD field and have no desire at all to go out and do all these things that I'm talking about, well, I certainly understand. You might not, you might not ace the course necessarily, but that's okay too. So, hope all this information is useful. Again, I will post as soon as I complete this video. I will post a number. It'll be up to no more than 20 points. It'll be in the week 6 assignments area, and that number is just the number for DQ1, and it will, just like last week, it will change to a higher number after the end of the week and all the other DQs are taken into consideration. So that's it for now, and take care everybody. I'll see you in the threads. So long.